The rain in Blackwood County doesn't just fall. It punishes. It's a cold, relentless autumn rain that turns the rich valley soil into a thick, gray slurry. A mud that's famous for swallowing the boots of honest men and the pride of the arrogant alike. It was October 14th, 2025, a Tuesday. The kind of day where the sky stays the color of a bruised lung from dawn until dusk. On the edge of the old Miller estate, 300 people gathered under a patchwork of umbrellas for the bankruptcy auction. There were bankers in charcoal overcoats, equipment dealers with eyes like calculators, and curious neighbors looking for a bargain. But in the dead center of that crowd, standing where the mud was deepest, was a girl who looked like she belonged to another century. Her name was Elena Vance. To the men standing near her, she was a ghost. She wore a canvas coat 3 sizes too large, stained with the permanent black ink of old diesel oil. Her boots were held together by duct tape and hope, and her hair was tucked tightly under a cap that had seen more miles than most of the trucks in the parking lot. She looked like she hadn't seen the inside of a warm house in months. She stood perfectly still, shivering slightly, her eyes locked on a single spot at the back of the equipment line. She was the homeless girl the locals had whispered about for weeks, seen sleeping in the cab of a beat-up 1998 Ford at the edge of the woods. People moved away from her as if poverty were contagious. They didn't see a person. They saw a failure. At the front of the crowd, sheltered by a pristine white golf umbrella held by a silent assistant, stood Julian Thorne. Julian was the king of the valley, the CEO of Thorne Heavy Industries, a man whose family had replaced the region's apple trees with gated communities and strip malls. His Italian leather shoes were miraculously clean, perched on a wooden pallet to keep him above the muck. He checked his gold watch. Then his eyes drifted toward Elena. He didn't see a threat. He saw an easy target for the kind of cruel sport that men like him enjoy. "Well, Miller," Julian shouted to the auctioneer, his voice carrying over the wind like a whip. "I didn't know we were allowing the local scenery to bid today. Tell me, dear," he directed at Elena, a smirk spreading across his face. "Are you here to buy a tractor? Or are you just waiting for the leftovers in the trash bin after we're done? Because I'm fairly certain they don't accept pocket change and good intentions at the clerk's table." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The kind of metallic laughter that happens when the powerful mock the weak. The auctioneer, a man whose mortgage was owned by Thorne's bank, let out a sycophant's chuckle. "Now, Julian, let's be professional. Though, I must admit, I don't see a bidder's number in her hand." Elena didn't move. She didn't blush. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out a damp, crumpled piece of yellow paper. "Bidder number 402. She held it up, her hand steady despite the cold. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her eyes stayed fixed on the object Julian was currently standing in front of. Lot 402. A 1950 case tractor. To anyone with half a brain, the machine was a tragedy. It was a hulking mass of orange rust, its tires cracked like parched earth, its engine block covered in layers of moss and bird droppings. It had sat in the tall grass for 20 years, a monument to a bankrupt era. To Julian Thorne, it was a piece of scrap metal worth maybe $300 at the junkyard. But as Elena looked at that machine, she wasn't seeing rust. She was seeing a memory. She was seeing the calloused hands of her grandfather, Silas Vance, as he taught her how to bleed a fuel line when she was 6 years old. She was seeing the night 10 years ago when the Thorne family lawyers had arrived with the foreclosure papers, and Silas had spent his final hours in the shed, whispering to this very machine as if it were a living thing. But there was something Julian Thorne didn't know. He thought he was the smartest man in the valley because he had a billion-dollar balance sheet. He didn't realize that this wasn't a standard case tractor. He didn't know that Silas Vance had spent the last years of his life in a secret obsession, rebuilding this specific engine with parts that didn't exist in any catalog. The bidding for the scrap heap opened at a pitiful $200. $200, the auctioneer barked. "Do I hear two?" Julian Thorne, bored and wanting to put on a show for his associates, raised a manicured finger. "500, he drawled. "Just so I can have the pleasure of watching the crusher take it." Elena's arm went up instantly. 600. The crowd turned. The girl had spoken. Her voice was low. raspy from the cold, but it had the weight of a stone hitting a deep well. Julian's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like they lived on soup kitchen handouts. 1,000, Julian said, his voice sharpening. 1,100, Elena replied. 2,000, Julian snapped. He was smiling now, but it was the smile of a predator. He wanted to see how far she would go before she broke. He wanted to drain every cent she had before she realized she was bidding on a coffin. I need to stop here and tell you something important. This story wasn't really about the machine. It was about the fact that for 5 years, Elena Vance had lived in the shadows of society. She had worked 12-hour shifts at shipyards in Seattle. She had cleaned fish in Alaska. And she had degreased heavy engines in the middle of the night, all for one purpose. She had tracked this specific serial number across 4 states. She knew that inside that rusted orange frame, her grandfather had hidden the only thing that could save her family's name. 4,000, Julian shouted, his face reddening. Let's end this little drama. The crowd went silent. $4,000 for a pile of rust. It was madness. All eyes turned to the girl in the oversized coat. She reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope. It was thick, wrapped in rubber bands, and stained with the grease of a dozen different jobs. $5,001, she said. The silence that followed was so heavy, you could hear the rain hitting the mud. Julian Thorne looked at the envelope, then at her. He let out a loud, mocking laugh. Fine, keep your rust. Girl, you just spent $5,000 on a paperweight. I hope it keeps you warm tonight when you're sleeping in your car. The gavel fell. Thud. Sold to bidder. 402. Elena walked forward through the parting crowd. She didn't look at Julian as she passed him. She didn't look at the people who were still snickering behind their hands. She walked straight to the case tractor and laid a hand on its frozen iron hood. What happened next was the part nobody forgot, because Julian Thorne was about to find out that the trash he had just let her buy was the only thing in the world that could stop the catastrophe that was about to unfold on the auction floor. But before we get to that, we have to talk about why that tractor was the most dangerous machine in Blackwood County. As the auction moved on to the flashy, modern equipment, Elena Vance remained by her rusted prize. Most people had already forgotten her, dismissing her as a tragic footnote to the day's events. But if they had looked closer, if they had looked past the rust and the peeling orange paint, they would have seen a master at work. Elena didn't just stand there. She began to communicate with the machine. She reached into her oversized coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound tool roll. The tools inside weren't new. They were smooth and dark, with the patina of 50 years of use. To understand why Elena had spent 5 years of her life searching for this specific case 1950, you have to understand Silas Vance. Silas wasn't just a farmer who lost his land. In the 1950s, he was a lead technician for the military's heavy transport division before he retired to the quiet life of an orchardist. When the Thorne family began their predatory takeover of the valley decades later, Silas knew he couldn't win in a courtroom filled with bought and paid-for judges. So, he built a silent guardian. He took the frame of a standard case tractor and rebuilt it from the crankshaft up. He used experimental high-nickel alloys for the gears, the kind of stuff they used in tank transmissions. He modified the fuel injection to handle the heavy pull. He called it Prototype 7, but in his journals, he simply referred to it as the Iron Heart. When Silas died, the bank seized everything, but they didn't know that the most valuable thing on the property wasn't the land. It was the secret welded into the very chassis of that rusted machine. Elena worked in silence. She bled the old, stagnant fuel from the lines, her movements precise and practiced. She cleaned the points with a scrap of sandpaper. She was waiting, and as if the universe were listening to her grandfather's ghost, the opportunity arrived. Julian Thorne was ready for his grand finale. He had purchased a $500,000 Liebherr excavator, a yellow Titan designed for the massive earth-moving required to build his luxury resort. He wanted to show off. He ordered his operator to drive the 50-ton beast across the auction lot and onto a heavy-duty transport trailer. "Watch this," Julian bragged to a group of investors, gesturing toward the excavator. This is what real power looks like. Not that antique garbage over there. But the Blackwood mud is a patient enemy. As the Liebherr reached the center of the yard, the ground didn't just give it. A hidden sinkhole, carved out by a week of torrential rain and poor drainage from Julian's own nearby construction site, opened up like a hungry mouth with a sickening, metallic groan. The 50-ton excavator tilted. One track was swallowed 3 feet deep into a slurry of gray clay and limestone. The crowd gasped. The massive machine was leaning at a 45-degree angle. If it tipped another 5 inches, it would be a total loss, and the recovery cost alone would be staggering. Julian's face went from arrogant pink to a deathly, chalky white. "Get the winch trucks. Get the John Deeres," Julian screamed. 2 brand new, 400-horsepower John Deere tractors were rushed to the scene. They were the pinnacle of modern technology, equipped with GPS, climate-controlled cabs, and more computing power than the Apollo moonlander. They hooked heavy steel cables to the Liebherr's chassis. The operator slammed them into gear. The engines roared, their massive tires throwing plumes of mud 60 feet into the air. But then, the computers took over. A warning light flashed on the dashboards. Transmission overload detected. To protect the delicate, high-tech components, the tractor's onboard systems automatically cut the power. They were designed for efficiency and safety, not for a fight against the Earth itself. They were too smart to risk their own survival. They groaned, they stalled, and they failed. Julian was in a full-blown panic. The Liebherr shifted again, a slow, grinding sound that signaled it was sinking deeper. That was when a shadow fell over him. Elena Vance stood there, the rain dripping off the brim of her cap. She didn't look like a homeless girl anymore. She looked like a judge. "Those machines won't pull it," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the rain. "They have horsepower, but they don't have the stomach for this mud. They're built for the showroom. This requires torque." Julian turned on her, his eyes wild with fury. "And I suppose you think that orange coffin of yours can do better. Get out of here, before I have the sheriff throw you off the property." "I'll pull it out," Elena said, ignoring his outburst. "I'll pull it out on one condition. You sign a witnessed agreement right now. If I move that excavator to solid ground, you refund my $5,000, and you apologize loudly to my grandfather's memory in front of everyone here." The crowd went silent. Julian looked at his sinking $500,000 machine, then at the rusted case 1950, sitting 50 yards away. He let out a hysterical, desperate laugh. "Fine. Deal. Because when you fail, and you will fail, I'm going to have that tractor crushed into a cube of scrap while you watch. Sheriff, witness this." The wager was set. The stakes weren't just money anymore. They were the final remnants of a family's dignity. Elena walked back to the case. "I need to tell you something about the sound of a machine that's been waiting 10 years to breathe. It's not like a modern engine. It's not a whine. It's a heartbeat." Elena climbed into the iron seat, which was cold and wet. She didn't use a key. She reached under the dash and toggled 2 heavy copper switches. She wrapped her hand around the starter cord, a modification Silas had added. And she didn't just pull it. She gave it her entire life's weight. The first pull, a cough of gray smoke. The second pull, a metallic sneeze that shook the frame. The third pull, the iron heart woke up. It wasn't a roar. It was a deep, rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump that seemed to sync with the very pulse of the valley. The exhaust stack blew a single, defiant plume of black soot high into the rainy sky. Elena shifted the long, notched lever into a gear that Julian Thorne didn't even know existed. A deep reduction creeper gear that Silas had hand-cut from hardened tool steel. But as the case began to crawl toward the sinkhole, something happened that made the sheriff lean forward in disbelief. Elena wasn't just driving. She reached under the dashboard and pulled a small, hidden lever, a secondary transmission, engaged a secret Silas had told her about when she was a child. "Watch the chain," she whispered to the machine. She didn't use the nylon straps the John Deeres had used. She reached into the belly of the case and pulled out a blackened, hand-forged steel chain that Silas had hidden there years ago. She hooked it to the Liebherr's main pivot point. The crowd moved back. The tension in the air was so thick you could taste the copper. Julian Thorne stood at the edge of the pit, his white umbrella trembling. He was waiting for the snap. He was waiting for the rust to give way. He was waiting for the girl to fail. But what happened next was the part that redefined the history of Blackwood County. It was the moment where old wisdom met modern arrogance, and only one of them was going to walk away. The chain didn't just tighten, it sang. It was a high-pitched, terrifying hum of steel under thousands of pounds of pressure. Every person in that muddy yard held their breath, waiting for the link to snap, waiting for the rusted orange frame of the case to fly apart like shrapnel. Julian Thorne stood at the edge of the pit, his knuckles white, as he gripped his umbrella. He wanted the failure. He needed it. Because if that girl, that ghost of a girl, succeeded where his $500,000 fleet had failed, it wouldn't just be a financial loss. It would be a total collapse of everything he stood for. Elena Vance leaned forward in the iron seat, her body becoming part of the machine. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at Julian. She kept her hand on the throttle, and her ear tuned to the vibration of the transmission. She wasn't just pulling a weight. She was listening for the limits of her grandfather's soul. Now, she whispered. She eased the throttle back. The case didn't scream like the John Deere's. It let out a sound that felt like a tectonic plate shifting deep underground. It was a guttural, earth-shaking roar that vibrated through the boots of every spectator. The rear tires, those ancient, cracked slabs of rubber, didn't spin. They bit. They dug through the gray slurry and found the bedrock Silas had known was there. The front wheels of the case lifted 6 inches off the ground, the iron frame groaning under the impossible load. And then, the impossible happened. The 50-ton Liebherr excavator, buried in the throat of the earth, gave a sickening, wet shudder. A single bubble of air escaped the mud with a loud pop. Slowly, so slowly, it was almost painful to watch. The yellow Titan began to move. It was inch by agonizing inch. The case's engine note, punishing growl. The exhaust stack glowing a faint, dull red in the rain. Elena held the line. She didn't flinch as the metal of the hitch began to warp. She just kept the torque steady. A master conductor of old-world physics. 5 minutes passed. 10. To the crowd, it felt like an hour. But when the Liebherr's tracks finally crested the edge of the sinkhole and found solid ground, a sound erupted that was louder than the engine. It wasn't laughter this time. It was a roar of genuine, primitive awe. The homeless girl had just performed a miracle with $5,000 worth of rust. Elena didn't stop until the excavator was 20 feet clear of the danger. She shifted the case into neutral, let the engine idle for a moment, a steady, victorious thump-thump, and then cut the fuel. The silence that followed was absolute. The rain continued to fall, but it felt different now. It felt like it was washing away the filth of the day's mockery. Julian Thorne stood like a statue, his mouth half open. He looked at the machine, then at the girl, then at the sheriff. The wager was clear. The Tripoli was due. But Julian, ever the snake, tried to find one last hole to crawl into. Impressive, he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. A lucky pull. I'll have my office send you the refund check on Monday. Now, if you'll excuse me. No, Elena said, stepping down from the tractor. Her voice wasn't loud, but it stopped Julian in his tracks. You're not going anywhere, and you're not sending a check. You're going to apologize to the memory of Silas Vance, right here, in the mud. And then, I'm going to show you what you really bought when you stole this land. The crowd pressed in. Julian looked around, seeing the faces of the people who had once feared him, now looking at him with pure, unadulterated contempt. He was a man who had lost his power the moment the case started its engine. He cleared his throat, his face a shade of humiliated purple. First, I apologize to the Vance family, he muttered to the ground. It was a capable machine. Louder, the sheriff said, stepping forward, his arms crossed. I apologize, Julian yelled, the sound echoing off the wet hills. But the story wasn't over. Elena walked to the side of the case tractor. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like someone finishing a very long, very painful job. She reached into the heavy steel frame, near the rear axle, and pressed a sequence of bolts that looked like nothing more than random rust spots. With a heavy, metallic click, a small, vacuum-sealed door popped open. It was a hidden compartment, welded into the very chassis of the machine, protected from the elements and from time. She pulled out a cylinder of blackened steel, and inside was a roll of parchment. She didn't hand it to Julian. She handed it to the county clerk. What he found later would change everything, the narrator's voice would say here, over a close-up of the document. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the original land grant from 1922, and attached to it was a private contract between the state and the Vance family that had been conveniently lost during the foreclosure. The document proved that the Thorne family hadn't just used legal loopholes, they had committed systemic, criminal fraud. They had forged the transfer deeds while Silas was in the hospital, thinking no one would ever find the original copies. Silas had known they were coming for him, so he had hidden the truth inside the only thing he knew they would never value. A rusted, old tractor. The legal fallout was a bloodbath. Julian Thorne didn't just lose the auction, he lost the valley. Within months, the Thorne Heavy Industries empire was dismantled by federal investigators. The silver-tongued CEO was stripped of his assets, his mansions, and his white umbrellas. He ended up in a small, gray apartment in the city, working as a low-level clerk, filing papers for the very courts he used to buy. He became a man who lived in the past, a man who had to walk to the bus stop every day in the rain, remembering the day he laughed at a girl who held his entire world in her grease-stained hands. But this story wasn't really about revenge. It was about the aftermath. If you drive through Blackwood County today, you won't find Julian's luxury resort. You won't find gated communities or strip malls. Instead, you'll see rows of apple trees that stretch as far as the eye can see. You'll see the Vance Heritage Farm, a place where the soil is respected and the old ways are kept alive. Elena Vance used the settlement money to turn the orchard into a sanctuary and a school. She built a massive stone workshop where the forgotten ones, the strays, the dropouts, the people the world has given up on, come to learn. They learn how to weld, how to fix a diesel engine, and how to find the value in things that are broken. In the center of the farm, under a glass pavilion that catches the first light of every dawn, sits the 1950 case. It's still rusted. It still looks like a pile of junk to the tourists who pass by. But to the people of the valley, it's a monument. It's a reminder that true power isn't found in the shine of a new machine or the balance of a bank account. It's found in the iron of the soul. Every year, on October 14th, the rain falls on Blackwood County, and every year, Elena Vance walks out to that pavilion. She doesn't say a word. She just climbs into the seat, toggles the copper switches, and pulls the cord. The thump-thump of the iron heart echoes across the hills, a sound that tells the world that some things are built to endure. It tells us that we should never judge a book by its tattered cover or a machine by its rust. It reminds us that arrogance is a house built on sand, and that quiet, humble wisdom is the bedrock that holds the world together. The next time you see someone standing in the mud, looking like they've lost everything, take a second look. Don't be the person with the white umbrella, because you never know what kind of engine is running inside them. You never know if they are just waiting for the right moment to show you that while the new world might have the horsepower, it's the old world that has the heart. And in the end, heart is the only thing that can pull you out of the mud. Elena Vance is still there, her hands still stained with oil, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. She knows that, as long as the iron heart beats, the valley is safe. And as the sun sets over the orchard, the sound of that old case tractor serves as a final, rhythmic promise that the truth, no matter how deep you bury it, will always find a way to pull itself free.